Ooh, welcome on into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and today we're going to be looking at how format affects how you draft. Now, I'm not going to ask you to sit here and read all this as I go through it. I did not really write it up to be presented, but I wanted to have something else on the screen. And as of now, at least, if I stick with this recording, I have not prepared any kinds of actual visuals, so this will at least allow me to give you a visual. Sorry, I know it's a little chintzy looking, but hey, the value is in the information, not how it's presented in this case, at least. So, just to let you guys know, if you're not aware, Tuesday, Thursday evenings, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I have been going live streaming, and we're doing, you can come in and ask questions, but we're doing fantasy drafts as well, practicing, and all sorts of them on the Sleeper app, which is very nice to use for that. Just drop the link, you join in. And we got a nice little group of people going on for it. We do some analysis afterwards. We talk ball. I think last night we talked for about 40 minutes or so afterwards, just talking about players. So it's good discussion, good practice. Come and join us. We'd love to have a full, start to get some full rooms for that as well. Would be helpful so we can get those darn computers to stop drafting. But let's start off here. How format affects your draft. First format difference we're going to look at is quarterbacks, 6-point versus 4-point per passing touchdown leagues. How might that impact how you're going to draft? So for a lot of this, I did like hypothesis, and then we'll look at that hypothesis. Thought that was a good format to go through for this. So hypothesis number one is going to be the value of the position, quarterback position, in 6-point per passing touchdown league formats as a whole goes up. Well, quarterbacks now score more fantasy points, so yes, it's going to go up relative to the other positions. Their value has gone up, and thus you should be more willing to draft them earlier than you would in 4-point per passing touchdown leagues. So I would say that this hypothesis is true. Hypothesis number two, the value of an individual quarterback in 6-point per passing touchdown league formats relative to the rest of the position changes. Now, we'll get to hold your horses, keyboard warriors. Give me a chance to get to hypothesis 3 before you start talking on this one. But on the whole, I took this very literally, and I'm going to say no. You should not force drafting a quarterback earlier because of the change in format, earlier than a different quarterback. Follow the flow of the draft if you're not targeting a specific quarterback. But theoretically, you should still end up drafting your quarterback higher than you would have in a 4-point per passing touchdown league due to the first hypothesis, which we found to be true. So true or false? It's going to depend on your draft strategy, I would say, ultimately here. Are you willing to grab 2 value quarterbacks later? Are you going to just follow the flow of the draft? Or are you targeting a top-end quarterback? Because in that case, yes, then you're going to need to draft that quarterback earlier than, once again, just like stated in hypothesis number 1. I know I'm very much splitting hairs here, and this might be a little bit confusing, and maybe I should have just left that out. But let's just move on to hypothesis number 3, the value of some individual quarterbacks. And now we're looking at specific individual quarterbacks in 6-point per passing touchdown league formats relative to the rest of the position changes. So that's kind of going back to unless you're targeting, I said specifically a top-end quarterback, but now we're just a little bit more generally, quarterback to quarterback, yeah, some of the values change compared to 4-point per passing touchdown league formats. Quarterbacks don't all score fantasy points equally. You should treat some quarterbacks differently, and thus your rankings / your draft order should change to that you're going to be using in draft. Quarterbacks on good offenses who throw for a lot of touchdowns are going to be more valuable in 6-point versus 4-point formats. Think of a Joe Burrow. And if the team has a bad defense, that's something that could help more, thinking specifically of Joe Burrow last season, potentially this season as well, if they don't sign some more people there. And then you have the opposite quarterback, the quarterbacks who run the ball a lot. They are technically going to be less value relatively in this format, valuable in this format than another. And when it comes to those top-end rushing quarterbacks, it really equaled out, doesn't matter too much. But let's take a guy like Anthony Richardson, who you're probably not drafting, but you might be thinking of drafting in a 4-point per, just to take a chance on an upside flyer type of option, you believe them, in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, well, in a 6-point per passing touchdown league, that's going to be much harder to do. And just generally speaking about these types of running backs, the consistency value of a rushing quarterback is going to remain in the 6-point per passing touchdown format. But now the ceiling of the throwing quarterback has gone up, is how that's going to work. So ultimately, I'm going to say this is true. You should treat quarterbacks relative to each other a little bit different. You should not be using the same rankings that you would in a 4-point per passing touchdown league in a 6-point league. Let's bring us on to a new format discussion, talking full PPR versus a standard scoring versus half PPR scoring. There's obviously a lot of things that we could go into, but let's look at hypothesis number 1. The wide receiver position is more valuable in full PPR than half PPR, and more valuable in half PPR than standard scoring, and thus even more valuable by a more drastic, number in full PPR than it is in standard scoring formats. And now this is very, very much the most remedial part of this. This is very obvious. Most of you know this. Some of you might need to be reminded of it, and we should all remember to think about these things while we are, drafting tie-breaker types of decisions between wide receivers depending on wide receivers. So, true, wide receivers are targeted more than any other position. So, their value increases more compared to other positions, the more fantasy points that you are rewarded per reception. Of course, there are always going to be specific outlier situations, individuals, etc. Hypothesis number 2. Individual wide receivers, running backs, tight ends, their values change based on the amount of points awarded or not per reception. True, wide receivers who get a lot of targets are going to be more valuable in full PPR than they are in half, and so on. True, tight ends who get a lot of targets are going to be more valuable in full than half, and so on. True, running backs who get a lot of targets are going to be more valuable in full than half, and so on. To take some extrapolation beyond the specific hypothesis that we stated, can also infer these things. So number 1 here, the value of players on good offenses goes up more in standard formats than it does for half, and even more so for full PPR, due to the importance of touchdowns. Just kind of taking the inverse of this other extrapolation that we called true for this hypothesis. And then number 2, the value of wide receivers, tight ends, running backs, who are expected to score more touchdowns, goes up more in standard formats than it does for half, or even more so for full PPR, which could be a complete different hypothesis in general. So I would say true. Touchdowns are more valuable in standard formats than they are in half or full PPR. More important in half than full as well. And as we know, touchdowns are a very unreliable stat. So that does, in one sense, make it tougher to draft in standard league formats, and makes the swings of your team even greater in those formats to some extent. And that's going to bring us on to tight end premium scoring leagues. So, hypothesis number 1, the tight end position is more valuable in tight end premium leagues than in other formats. Intuitively, this is true. They are scoring more points now. Now their value has gone up compared to other positions at a higher rate. However, there are also many factors that would go into how you might, splice that up within the position. The specific scoring format, the specific scoring of the tight end premium league is going to alter some things as well. But the most common tight end premium scoring format is to award 1.5 fantasy points per reception rather than 1 for full PPR leagues, and I would say 1 compared to a half for half PPR leagues, or maybe a half compared to none in standard leagues. So we can go back up to the previous discussion about full PPR, etc., to conclude that the value within the position from player to player also will change based on expected reception totals, which I think brings us to a new hypothesis. It's going to be hypothesis number 2, and that is that the separation in value from one tight end to another in tight end premium leagues is multiplied at a greater rate than it is in non-tight end premium scoring leagues. This will become more clear as I explain. A lot of tight ends don't get a lot of targets. It's just a problem with the position in terms of fantasy, and especially, once again, full PPR compared to non-PPR, their value. However, some tight ends do. The value of the tight ends that do, thinking your Brock Bowers, 153 targets last season, your Trey McBride, 147 targets, their value is going to go up at a much higher rate relative to not only other tight ends, but to the draft field as a whole. But when we look at compared to other tight ends, we're going to compare it to the value of these guys who get fewer targets. Your Cade Ottens, who had 87 targets last season. Your Tucker Kraft, who only had 70 targets last season. Mark Andrews only had 69 targets last season. That disparity gets greater. So finding the value tight ends in premium leagues is much different and much more possible, I would argue, than it is in other formats. You should be cognizant of opportunity all the more, in terms of reception totals opportunity, of course. Take a guy like Hunter Henry last year, who was on a team that had a very questionable wide receiver core. I shouldn't say cognizant of opportunity. I'll get more into that. Not just, well, it leads up to opportunity for receptions, of course. So, take a guy like Hunter Henry last year, who was on a team that had a very questionable wide receiver core. He was someone who was an afterthought in regular leagues, but he should definitely have been on radars in tight end premium leagues, and I think that there were analysts out there who had them on the radars more specifically for that kind of league for this reason. Then, you could take a guy this year like a Mason Taylor. He strikes me as someone who is in a great situation with a poor wide receiving core. I don't think anybody would argue any differently. I know we have a great number one there, Garrett Wilson, not taking anything from that. Talking about the wide receiver core in general. And he's someone who I think might be worth taking a flyer on, all the more in a tight end premium league. And as we know, the more points awarded for receptions, the less we are concerned with how good the overall team is. We don't really expect the Jets to be some great team. And, of course, how relevant touchdowns are, or how much more important they are or are not in this case. So, even more so, in a tight end premium scoring leagues, he is a guy who has more potential in that format than he might in other formats, where, personally, I already am kind of high on him. So, in conclusion, the disparity between tight end 1 and the tight end 15 is much greater in tight end premium leagues than it is in non-tight end premium leagues, thus making getting them more important high up in drafts. That's going to bring us on to the best ball versus redraft. And I know some of this, like for some of you, it's quite remedial, but it isn't all for everybody, and it's not always something that we think about, and sometimes we just need these reminders while we come up with our draft strategies. So that's, what a lot of this is for. Let's look at best ball versus redraft. My hypothesis here is that inconsistent players are more valuable in best ball leagues than they are in redraft leagues. And this is one of those narratives that's out there, and I fully believe that it is true. You should be less concerned about consistency in best ball league formats than you are in redraft league formats. The reasoning behind that is due to the nature of the best ball format. Less often will an inconsistent player be a liability for your team. The level of liability that inconsistent players are in redraft has more to do with why this is true than saying that they're quote-unquote more valuable in best ball. Now, they become more valuable, but I think it could be a little bit misleading to just say that they're straight up more valuable. They're more valuable because their inconsistency is less of a liability. So it's like kind of a two negatives type of argument. If all goes well, and it does have to go well, don't forget that. I mean, there's definitely a gambling aspect with best ball for many reasons. But if all goes well, the boom weeks will help your team more than we're talking about the liability. Those bust weeks will hurt your team. In either format, you want the players who will score the most fantasy points. But how those fantasy points are scored is just going to be less important for best ball than it is in redraft, because you're not having to make those start-sit decisions that can cause you to miss out on a boom week for a player or player in your lineup during a bust week on accident, unluckily, whatever the case may be. Now, for the rest of this, or the next one, the rest of it, I don't recall if there's two. I think it's just this next one, the last of this video. I'm going to drop the hypothesis stuff. It's just going to make it a little bit easier to cover. just to cover some basic strategies that are relevant in league sizes. Yeah, so we're going to go into a couple of different strategies here throughout this. It's going to morph and evolve as we go through here. So 8-team or smaller league strategy. Simultaneously, we're just going to look at the inverse of that for larger league strategies. So what I'm saying here is in 8-team or smaller league strategy, you should wait on the quarterback position. The smaller your league, the less important it is for you to get one of the top quarterbacks. And the far less important it is that you get the quarterback 7, 8, 6, 11. Let a league mate take 2 of them off the board in these small formats before you touch the position, and you'll still be fine because it's basically, once you get to quarterback 7-ish, quarterback 18-ish is just not going to have a huge difference on the end results of how many weeks you end up winning games or not. That's just mathematically how it works out, theoretically, all that good stuff. But what I do want to say, I'm going to backtrack here a little bit. That's my advice a lot of the years, but there is a very valid flip side to this argument, which is to go out and get the number 1 quarterback. And I would say, actually, maybe like the number 3 quarterback, one of those top few quarterbacks, depending on the season and how we view them. But that first tier of quarterback, I would argue, get at the back end of that tier in any format, but maybe even more so important in these small leagues because every pick matters. You're going to be facing off against better competition more often. So the more positional advantages that you can find, and the more consistently you can capitalize on those advantages, which is something that you can't quite control, the better. But if you get those guys who more consistently perform, then obviously the more consistently you should be able to capitalize on that. Capitalize meaning win the week. So it depends. The draft year for me, there are years where I have a target or 2 that is going to be going late at the quarterback position that I feel very confident in terms of finishing at that quarterback 7 or greater. Those years, I would definitely wait because I feel confident about some guy that I think I can get quite a bit later. Last year, that player was Jaden Daniels. This is a year where I would actually probably target one of those top guys. I don't really have a sleeper at the quarterback position in this year's draft, but last year Jaden Daniels was, I believe, going ADP 13. I liked him to at least be quarterback 7 with potential to be a top 4-ish quarterback was where my mind was. And he did perform up to that. Another thing here for small 8-team or smaller league format strategy, the smaller the league, the more this is important. Do get a top tight end. Even the sleeper tight ends usually only climb to tight end 7, which does not give you any kind of positional advantage. This is the ambiguity between the tight end 7 and the tight end 18 is even greater than the ambiguity between the quarterback 7. And I would actually say more like 15-ish most seasons. Next, a little bit here. There will be a lot of waiver wire opportunities. So take more risks with your mid and late round picks. Rookies, injury-prone guys that can be had at a value, etc. in these smaller league formats. So to keep it quick, for larger league formats, thinking not at least, but 14-plus team leagues, you're going to want to do the opposite of that. You're going to want to take on less risk because it's going to be harder to replace any of your mistakes or bad luck, whatever it may be that happens throughout the season. You're going to be facing top tight ends less. So it's less important that you get one. Make sure not to miss out on a quarterback, though, in these larger leagues. Whether you're to plan to take a couple of value guys or not, just don't be left with the quarterback 20 and the quarterback 26 on your roster. I would argue to get at least one within what I'm arguing this year, I'm saying is the top 15 in order to be safe. And that quarterback advice also goes for superflex types of league formats. Don't ignore the quarterback in that format. Please don't. You can't afford to be playing trash in your quarterback spot, and you should be playing 2 quarterbacks most weeks in most league superflex league formats, preferably. The other advice that I would give for larger league formats is to be aggressive. It's going to be a long time before you're going to be on the clock again in those drafts. So get ahead of the curve, if nothing else. Get the guys that you believe in. Don't take the guys that you're like, but the value's there. Just go, ignore the ADP. Runs are going to happen, and the guy that you're taking, this guy that you're questionable on, but you're saying, I think Travion Henderson could get back around to me, though. There's a chance. His ADP is, like, right there. I'm going to take the risk on it. Just take Travion Henderson. Just go for it, okay? So there you go. Those are some quick tips, strategy things based on differing formats, and all of these things can weigh up against each other. Speaking of like that last advice that we're talking about with this sentence where you can't afford to be playing trash at your quarterback spot, and you should be playing 2 quarterbacks, most leagues in most league formats preferably. The disparity between the top quarterback in a 4-point passing league between that quarterback and a wide receiver in a full PPR league is less than a passing quarterback in a 6-point per passing league and a wide receiver in a non-PPR league. So, these strategies stack on each other too, depending on all the different variables within your league format, league scoring, etc. So thank you very, very much for tuning in. I hope you learned something. I know some of it was really remedial, etc. But I hope I placed it out there for you to be good information. So let me know if that's the case or not. And let me know any kinds of topics that you're interested in hearing. I'm trying to do some topic-based videos this year, some different stuff than I did last year, which requires a lot of time that I just don't have as much of this year in terms of creating the spreadsheets for that stuff. So ideas are very much appreciated. I am thinking of looking at like some Las Vegas numbers and helping to adjust my rankings based on some of those numbers because Vegas knows best. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you for tuning in.